All right, well, we are glad to have you. This week, obviously, is Thanksgiving week, and so I have kind of been building to this point for our sermon series this month. And so I have centered our series around stories from the table, this idea of coming to the table. And so what does it mean? How does Jesus use the table in the scriptures? And so we started with the idea that there is good news at the table. When we looked at the call of Levi, Jesus says, come and follow me. And Levi gave up everything and left to go follow Jesus. But he also invited those that didn't know Jesus to come and have a meal. And so at that meal, there was good news at the table. The next week, we looked at the idea of the fact that there is room at the table. So Jesus is dining with a Pharisee at this time, and there's an immoral woman who comes and anoints his feet with oil. And so at that time, the Pharisee is so consumed with who this person is, and he's trying to add Jesus into his religious system, but the woman has realized that it's only Jesus, that her attention is only to him. And so what we saw in that is that there is room at the table. You don't have to clean yourself up before you come to Jesus. We come to Jesus as we are, and then he works in and through us, right? And so then last week, we spent some time looking at Zacchaeus and the call of Zacchaeus, and we learned that there is plenty at the table. Plenty at the table. And so we looked at how I had a good friend come over and he was clutching his 2 pieces of pizza, right? And that he didn't realize that it was buffet night at the Malones. I've since had a conversation about this story with my parents. They're here today. And they validated everything that I said. That it was, buffet night at the Malones, and yet he was holding on. But we saw that Zacchaeus, while Jesus, in speaking with the rich young ruler, that man was unwilling to give away his possessions because they had a stranglehold on him. Whereas Zacchaeus was willing to give away everything he had because he realized he had access to the source, that there's plenty at the table. And so just in time for Thanksgiving, almost as if I planned it, this week we're looking at forgiveness at the table. I think some of us need to implement a little bit of forgiveness with our families, right? And so I'm going to give you a story from my table, but before we do there, if you want to be ahead of the class, we're going to be in John chapter 21. John chapter 21 today. So a story from my table. When I was a kid, I was just a poor, neglected child, right? There were 4 of us. And to this day, in my house and in my family, between the children, there is a lot of infighting about who is the favorite child, right? And so many would say, well, I'm the oldest and I was the first, and so therefore I'm the favorite. And others would say, well, I'm the baby and I, was the cutest and got everything that I wanted, so clearly I'm the favorite. And then others would say, well, I'm the funniest and the most like dad, and so clearly I'm the favorite and the most humble of us. We wouldn't even try to claim that we were the favorite, right? Even though that probably is the case in my situation, that I am in fact the favorite. But my parents, my mom's response, even now to this story, or to that statement, because we'll make it, on Friday when we get together, there will be some sort of argument about who the favorite child is. It just comes up because we're competitive. I don't know, somehow my parents raised 4 incredibly competitive children. My mom, her statement always is, can't we all just get along? I have loved you all equally. You're all my favorite. I have no favorites. Can't we all just get along, right? And so they really, to me, they put that into practice. They modeled this idea of love and non-favoritism my entire life. And really, I don't think that there is a favorite child in our family because my parents were very intentional about creating opportunities to make every kid feel loved and feel special. And so my favorite night of the year typically happened in early August, okay? So with 4 kids, comes 4 different sets of back-to-school clothes and 4 different sets of school supplies and 4 different sets of new shoes and 4 different sets of everything, right? And so my parents' solution to this problem was to allot each kid a specific dollar amount. Every kid had the same dollar amount, and it was my money. It was our money. And so once a year per kid, we would go, just me and mom and dad, out for a night on the town, the 3 of us. And so the purpose of this evening was to get our school supplies. And so they would give us our money up front, and it was up to us how we spent that money. They said, this is your money. It's not my money, it's your money. So you spend it however you want. So if you wanted to be like very frugal and you just get basic school supplies and a basic backpack and a basic pair of jeans and a shirt from Old Navy and a basic pair of shoes, whatever cash you had at the end of the night, that was yours. And if perhaps you wanted a very specific backpack and a very specific pair of American Eagle jeans and a very specific Hollister shirt, you already said Levi and you got it. And so you were allowed to spend the money however you wanted. It was everybody got the same amount of money. And so they fostered in us this ability to, number one, see what we had and figure out how to use that responsibly. But then number 2, they fostered in us this idea that you were all worth the exact same amount. You're all worth the same money. But that was only the first half of the night because we had them for the whole night. So I never have the undivided attention of my mom because there's 3 other hoodlums running around my house screaming all the time. But this one night a year, I have my mom and my dad to myself. And so we will go to the stores that I want to go to, and we will go buy the clothes that I want to buy, and we'll spend as much time or as little time as I want to shopping. But then I get to pick the restaurant. And so on their dime, I get to pick the restaurant. And so I don't have to pay for the restaurant. So let's say, I don't know, perhaps you wanted to go to Chili's and get an order of baby back ribs. That was on the table. You were allowed to do that. And so I would go to Chili's and I would order baby back ribs. And at that meal, at that table, it was all about me. What do you want to talk about? What are you interested in? What's going on in your life? But the purpose of this evening wasn't just to lavish attention on me. It was to show me love. But what they were doing was they were reestablishing who I was before I went out to the new school year. We would get to this meal, and it would start out like every other meal. We would talk about what's going on in our life. We would talk about things that would happen. But inevitably, we would get to a point where we would be reminded of this specific phrase. And I can remember my mom saying this over and over and over. Don't forget who you are, and don't forget whose you are. Don't forget who you are, and don't forget whose you are. Because what that means for me is, number one, I'm Andrew, but more than that, I'm Andrew Malone. Okay? Don't forget who you are. That last name Malone, even now, carries weight in Bonham. That people know, for better or worse, who the Malones are. And so what you do, you are a Malone. But more than that, don't forget who you are, but don't forget whose you are. That when you go into this school year and you're facing new challenges and you're facing things that you may or may not have seen before, you need to remember above all else that you are a child of God. That when you're going into this situation, that as you're gearing up for the school year, you need to remember who you are. I'm a Malone, but you need to remember first and foremost whose you are. You're a child of God. And in fact, I can think about situations where I would even go out with friends in the middle of the school year. And so I would ask my parents, hey, can I go out with so-and-so? I'm not going to name names, but can I go out with so-and-so, and we're going to go to Sherman, and we're going to go bowling and do all this? And my mom would say, yeah, that's fine, but don't forget who you are, and don't forget whose you are. Because if you're going to go do these things, then you need to be reminded of who you are and whose you are. That you need to know intrinsically where your identity is. Because we don't do certain things in our family because of who we are and whose we are. And we do behave certain ways in our family because of who we are and whose we are, right? And so what I see today in today's story, John chapter 21, is a crisis of identity. And what we'll see at Jesus' table is that there is forgiveness at the table, but we will also see Jesus reestablish Peter's identity, both in who he is and whose he is. So let's look at John chapter 21. John 21, it says this, "And after this, Jesus revealed himself again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. He revealed himself in this way: Simon Peter, Thomas called twin, Nathanael from Cana of Galilee, Zebedee's sons, and 2 others of his disciples were together. I'm going fishing," Simon Peter said to them. "We're coming with you," they told him. And they went out and got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. When daybreak came, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not know it was Jesus. "Friends," Jesus called to them, "you don't have any fish, do you?" "No," they answered. "Cast the net on the right side of the boat," he told them, "and you'll find some." And so they did, and they were unable to haul it in because of the large number of fish. And the disciple, the one that Jesus loved, said to Peter, "It is the Lord." And when Simon Peter had heard that it was the Lord, he tied his outer clothing around him, for he had taken it off, and he plunged into the sea. And since they were not far from land, about 100 yards away, the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish. And when they had got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire there, with fish lying on it and bread. "But some of the fish bring some of the fish you just caught," Jesus said to them. So Simon Peter climbed up and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And even though there were so many, the net was not torn. "Come and have breakfast," Jesus told them. And none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. And Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and he did the same with the fish. And this was now the 3rd time Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said to him, "you know that I love you." "Feed my lambs," he told him. And a second time he asked him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord," he said to him, "you know that I love you." "Shepherd my sheep," he told him. And he asked him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter was grieved that he had asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." "Feed my sheep," Jesus said. "For truly I tell you, when you were younger, you would tie your belt and walk wherever you wanted. But when you grow old, you will stretch your hands out, and someone else will tie you and carry you where you don't want to go." And he said this to indicate by what kind of death Peter would glorify God. And after saying this, he told him, "Follow me." So what we see here is a pretty interesting story. This is at the end of John's gospel. This is the last thing, really, that John writes in his gospel. And what he's writing is about a time that's after Jesus' crucifixion. And so this time for Jesus' followers is really a time of distress. In fact, the last week preceding this, or the last couple of weeks preceding this, that had been kind of a week full of emotions for the disciples. Because they enter into Jerusalem with crowds chanting, "Hosanna, Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel." And they experience the love of Jesus firsthand at the Lord's Supper. They experience terror as Jesus is taken away from them in the Garden of Gethsemane. They experience sorrow as their king, the man they had devoted their lives to, is convicted as a common criminal and sentenced to death in the most painful and humiliating way possible. They experience great fear as this religious movement that they helped start comes crumbling down right before their eyes. They experience wonder as the risen Jesus appears to them on a couple of occasions and gives them instructions. And they experience doubt about whether or not what they've seen with Jesus is true and what they're called to do next. There's a wide range of emotions that's facing all of these. But in particular, what's facing Peter is even more grieving than that, I would think. All of the disciples experienced the elation of coming into Jerusalem. And I think all of the disciples experienced the love that Jesus showed them when he was washing their feet. I think all of the disciples experienced fear as to what's next, and all of the disciples would have been incredibly confused as to what's happening. Because this is the Messiah. In fact, that's what Andrew says when he tells Peter. He says, hey, we found the Messiah, the one that the prophets were talking about. In the Jewish mind, what they had found was they had found the conquering king that was going to overthrow Rome and restore Israel to its political power. And so now this religious or political movement that they have helped started has come crumbling down in front of their eyes. This man that was supposed to live and reign forever has been killed and killed in the most embarrassing way possible. That now these disciples who just a few days ago were arguing about, when you come into your kingdom, let me sit at your right hand so that I can have power over people. And Jesus says, you don't get it. You don't understand what's happening. And so they have gone from these people who think that they're about to inherit glory to a people that have lost everything according to the world's eyes. And yet it's worse for Peter. Peter could have been looked at as the leader of the disciples. Peter could have been looked at as one of Jesus' most zealous followers. I kind of look at Peter and I think Peter's a lot like myself because he just spouts off at the mouth before thinking about things, right? Peter was the one that stood next to Jesus and cut off the slave's ear. And then Jesus is like, hey, stop that. You're not helping me. And he fixes the guy's ear, right? And now Peter, after experiencing all this, denies Christ 3 times. And so I think that what we see here is John is kind of giving us a glimpse into the internal struggle that Peter's having. Peter doesn't know who he is anymore. This person who has been named Rock has become unmoored from his point of anchor. In fact, when Jesus meets Peter for the first time, when he calls him for the first time, he says, I'm going to change your name from Simon to Cephas, which means the Rock, like Dwayne the Rock Johnson, you know, the nickname there. He's changing Peter's name because in Hebrew culture, in early culture here, names were significant. Jesus gave him a name that was to signify the life that he was supposed to live. And Peter boldly claims, hey, even if all of these other disciples leave you, I will still remain. And so Peter had set himself up for the greatest fall of any of the disciples. Peter has publicly denied Jesus 3 times. Peter is in this identity crisis, and so he doesn't know what to do. So he says to his friends in verse 3, I'm going fishing. I'm going fishing. I think to me that's a sad sentence. Effectively, what Peter is telling his friends is, I'm going to go back to what I was doing. I'm going to go back to what Jesus had called me away from. I have failed as a follower of Jesus. And so now I'm going fishing. I'm going to just be a fisherman again. Peter has turned back and seen his old life and has kind of picked that mantle up again because he is so distraught about his identity that he doesn't know who he is Maybe I'm Simon, the son of John, the fisherman. And he has forgotten whose he is. Peter, the rock. And so we go on and we see that over the course of the evening, that Simon, son of John, the fisherman, has failed at being a fisherman. But more than that, what I see in this is the symbolism of what happened in Peter's life when Jesus called him. Do you remember the story from Luke chapter 5? In Luke's gospel, when Jesus encounters Simon and his brother Andrew on the shore, Jesus is speaking to a large crowd of people. And this is coming right after Andrew and Simon had spent the night fishing. And they had failed as fishermen. They didn't catch anything. And so Jesus tells them to go out into the water and cast their nets one more time. And Peter, the professional fisherman, actually Simon, the professional fisherman, says, okay, I'll do it as you say, Master. I'll go out and throw these fish, but we're not going to get anything. And they catch so many fish that it almost capsizes their boat. Andrew, Simon, James, and John are on the very same sea, potentially in the very same boat, almost likely with the very same nets in John 21 as they were in Luke chapter 5. And so for Peter, what he's experiencing is this vision of a great miracle that he has seen Jesus do. And what happened, what followed up with that miracle is Jesus said, follow me and I'll make you a fisher of men. Simon, the son of John, had taken up this mantle of being a fisherman again, and he had forgotten whose he was. He was no longer, or at least at this moment, not operating as Simon, the fisher of men. And so we go on and we see that Simon realizes what has happened, that the disciple, verse 7, the one that Jesus loved, said, Peter, it's the Lord. And when Simon Peter heard it, he tied his outer clothing around him and he, what? Jumped into the sea. When did Peter do that? In John chapter 5, Jesus is seen feeding the 5,000 and then walking on the water. And this is when Peter jumps out of the boat and walks on water, right? And yet here he plunges into the sea and he's swimming back. You don't think this is flooding into Peter's mind? This great moment that he had had with Jesus. And so now he's rushing to the shore. And then we see when he gets to shore, it says when they got out on land, verse 9, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish lying on it and bread. This is really interesting in my study this week. There are only 2 instances in the entire New Testament where the phrase charcoal fire is used. Only 2. Both in John's Gospel. Once in chapter 21 and once in chapter 18, verse 18. Do you know what happens in chapter 18, verse 18? Peter denies Jesus. Only 2 instances in the whole New Testament, and John makes a point of using that language there and here. And so Peter, who is having this internal struggle about who he is and whose he is, he jumps out of the boat and he comes upon Jesus, and what does he see but the very thing that he was standing around when he denied Jesus? A charcoal fire. You don't think that charcoal fire brought back to this mind what he was struggling with, who he was, whose he is? And yet on that fire, what we see is fish lying on it and bread. Now, admittedly, this one's a stretch. But do you remember what happens in John chapter 6? When Jesus uses fish and bread to feed 5,000 and upwards of 20,000 people? So what Peter sees is 2 things. He sees his greatest failure, but he also sees an example of what's Jesus' greatest miracle that he has seen him do. And so Peter again is struggling with who I am. Who am I? I've denied Christ. I've turned my back on him. And not only once, which would have been bad enough, but I've done it 3 times. And yet Jesus tells him to bring some fish. Come have breakfast with me. At this point, none of the disciples are even questioning who this is anymore. They've realized this is Jesus, but it's like that awkward, uncomfortable silence that you get at the Thanksgiving meal when somebody brings up politics and then nobody wants to talk anymore. That's kind of where we're at here. They can experience the tension that is palpitating. Should have said that. The palpable tension that's radiating between Peter and Jesus. And so they share this meal together, and Jesus took the bread and gave it to them. And he did the same with the fish. Similar language to what Jesus does on the Last Supper when Peter experiences the love of who Jesus is. That Jesus takes the bread and he breaks it. And he gives it out to them, and he says, every time you take this meal, do so in remembrance of me, in remembrance of what I've done. And so Jesus, the resurrected Savior, has come and has broken the bread and handed it to Peter, and Peter is eating in silence. And so then after the meal, Jesus takes Peter on a little walk. And he says, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? I think that's got to be a cutting statement too. Not that Jesus was trying to cut him down, but do you hear what he calls him? He doesn't call him Cephas. He doesn't even call him Peter. He calls him Simon, son of John. Gosh, who am I? Peter is confused. Simon, son of John. And then he says, do you love me more than these? Matthew 26, verse 33, Peter says, even if all of these disciples desert you, I won't. And Jesus says, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And he says, you know that I love you. Feed my lambs, he told him. And a second time he asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, he said to him. You know that I love you. Shepherd my sheep, he told him. And he asked a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was grieved that he had asked him a third time. Lord, he said, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus says, feed my sheep. Truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you would tie your belt and walk wherever you wanted. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will tie you and carry you where you don't want to go. And he said this to indicate by what kind of death Peter would glorify God. And after saying this, he told him, follow me. What we see in this story is someone who is struggling with their identity. That he had made a tremendous error in following Jesus. That he had already said, yes, Lord, I'll follow you, and yet he had turned his back on Jesus when it became difficult. But I think the strange statement at the end, in fact, you'll notice I left it off of my notes because at the time of typing out my slides, it didn't fit in my mind why Jesus would conclude with Peter's death. But after milling it over and thinking through, what Jesus does is he prophesies or he promises a future in which when times get tough, Peter will die for this ministry, for this gospel. Because what Jesus is doing is he is restoring Peter to who he is. You are not just Simon, son of John. That's who you are. That's important for you. But whose you are, you're mine. You're a child of the King. You are Peter. You're going to establish the church. You're going to build the church. And even in your death, you're going to glorify God. There's forgiveness at the table. I think for a lot of us, we can fit into this mold of who Peter is. I think maybe for some of us today, we have kind of lost our identity with what it means to be a child of God. Our identity is wrapped up in what we do for work. Our identity is wrapped up in who our family is. Our identity is wrapped up in who we are or who we voted for or what we think is right. And what Jesus is saying is, you've got to remember who you are. Those are aspects of who you are. But you've got to operate out of whose you are. That you're a child of God. I think there's some of us in this room that don't even know whose we are. That we can't operate like Peter, who's being restored after this great sin, that we've never even entered into a relationship with Jesus. And so how is it for us to be able to come back to him when we never come to him in the first place? You've got to know who you are, but you've got to know whose you are. Peter was able to look back and see the things that God has done in his life in order to restore his sense of identity and his future in what he was going to do. That he had seen time and time and time again that Jesus had operated in his life. That he had done miracles, that he had used Peter to do miracles. And so even in the midst of this struggle that Peter was going through, Jesus was able to use the struggle to point to the identity. That there's forgiveness at the table. I think in light of Thanksgiving, I said this tongue-in-cheek earlier, but I think some of us are in the position that we need to give some forgiveness. I think there are people in our families who have done things to us that we say, I will never forgive them. They may come and they may eat and they may do this and we may share the table and we may be civil, but I cannot forgive them. You've got to remember who you are and whose you are. That there is not a thing that a family member of yours has done to you that you haven't done already to the Lord. And yet Jesus looks at Peter, Jesus looks at you, and in the midst of your sin, chooses to come and live and die. The Bible says that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. We didn't change ourselves. We didn't merit this death. We weren't good enough for 5 seconds that God was like, okay, they're good enough, let's send them. While we were still sinners, Christ came and died. There's forgiveness at the table. I don't know your life. I don't know your family. Maybe you say, boy, Pastor, if you knew my family, you'd speak differently. I will say the same. That there should be forgiveness at your table. But I think even in the midst of this, in the midst of ministry, in the midst of a new political cycle, let's talk about that. Large change coming in our politics in the next 2 months. For some of us, we've been celebrating, praise God that we're going to get this change, but there are other Bible-believing Christians who are concerned that America is going to end because their political selection did not make it. And I'm not here to tell you who to vote for. I will never do that. But what I'm saying is that there are Christians, believe it or not, on both sides of this argument. And so, as people, who we are matters, but whose we are matters. And so when we're facing down this opportunity to be Christians, to be examples in the community of whose we are in this new political cycle, we still need to be mindful of whose we are. Who do we belong to? I'm a child of God. And so my hope is not on any sort of political king. The Bible says that kingdoms rise and fall at the whim of God. That God is sovereign, that God is in control. And so I would argue that Satan wasn't really just quaking in his boots about either of these candidates. That it didn't matter to him which one got elected, right? But God is the one who's in control. And so we as children of God need to remember whose we are, and there needs to be forgiveness at the table. That our identity in Christ drives us to love and care for others. Jesus gives us two great commands. Love God, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And love your neighbor as yourself. In that story, in that parable, the neighbor was the enemy of the Jew. And that's the example that Jesus gives as the neighbor. You've got to remember who you are. I'm Andrew Malone. That carries weight. People know the Malones. I'm best known as Morgan's son and Levi's brother. That's part of me. But I've got to remember whose I am. I'm a child of the King.